and welcome to the second installment of my Dead by Daylight weapons series. I had so much fun making the first one. I had even more fun making today's weapon, which, as you saw in the intro, is the Spirit's Shattered Katana. Now, if I'm being totally honest, I've never played the Spirit because I suck at playing killers, but I think she is super freaking cool. And when I looked up that this is what her weapon looked like up close, I just had to make it. Like, I had to. It's so freaking cool. It presented a lot of unique challenges, just given what it is, but I really did have a really great time experimenting with this, because I haven't had time to do a lot of like experimenting lately, so this is really cool. So I am going to show you step by step how I made this, start to finish, paint and all. So let's get into it. But before we get into that, I do have to mention our absolutely amazing sponsor for this video and the rest of the weapons series, because they were so freaking generous and I love them so much. Our sponsor is Coscom Cosplay Supplies. Coscom has totally become my go-to cosplay shop online. They have everything I need. They have EVA foam in different densities, different thicknesses. They have foam clay. They have Plastidip, every cutting and carving device you can possibly think of. So it's definitely a one-stop shop and you absolutely have to check them out. Their prices are super competitive. Their shipping is great. And speaking of shipping, if you buy 2 sheets of foam, your entire order ships free. How much better can you get? I first started talking to the people at Coscom when I won their cosplay competition on Instagram last year, and they were so freaking nice. Like, they're awesome. They're super helpful. They are really, really supportive of the community. They just want to share, and they want to help support cosplayers, and they want to help us make amazing things. So definitely show them some love. You're going to see their products all throughout this video, and you're going to hear my honest thoughts and opinions on all of it. So definitely stay tuned and be sure to check them out. Now on to the fun stuff. First things first, gotta get this big old pattern put together. You can find the link for this and all my Dead by Daylight patterns in the description below. For the central structure of this sword, I used a 3/16 inch steel rod. If you'd like to avoid further stress, try to find something a little thinner than I did. I'll explain later. Oh, and I also bought the wrong length, so I had to cut it. And speaking of cutting, yeah, sorry, there's a lot of it. You'll want to make sure you label these blade pieces with as much info as possible. I numbered them and also noted the direction and overlap of each piece. I then taped them together so I have a front and a back. The handle portion is a little simpler, so there's that at least. I started with the handle pieces. For this, I used 4 pieces of 6mm EVA 60. I only rough cut the pieces for now so that I can take them over to the bandsaw. But I don't want to glue them together just yet. I still need to be able to put the rod in the center. So I'm just temporarily gluing them with a few dabs of contact cement in order to cut them nice and clean with the bandsaw. You can easily cut each piece individually using a knife, but the bandsaw does provide a perfectly straight cut, and then you know they're all exactly the same. Once cut, I popped them apart again to add the support rod. I quickly marked up the placement and then carved in a V-groove on both halves. I then repeated this process on the smaller handle piece. The metal rod was then glued into the V-groove using the same old Barge contact cement, and I made sure this was good and secure. Now the rest of the piece can be easily strung on just like a necklace. Now for the sanding. And let me tell you, this EVA 60 from Coscom sands like an absolute dream. It sands super fine using the big oscillating belt sander as well as the Dremel. I was able to round edges and smooth my pieces very quickly without the rough, pilly finish that EVA 38 sometimes has. Needless to say, I was super happy with the results. Next, to add a few more detail pieces. The ring on the back of the handle was made with two 8mm pieces of EVA 60. I marked the bevel and spent a long amount of time sanding it down. If you're not covered in foam dust by the time you're done, you didn't do it right. Now for something else fun and surprisingly foamy, filigree. This sword is covered in very fine filigree patterns, and I was determined to find a simple but effective way to accomplish this. And I discovered embossing folders. These are used in scrapbooking to emboss regular old paper, but it turns out they work perfectly as molds for foam clay. And since they're super flat, the final piece is very thin and delicate, just like filigree should be. So the technique here is super easy. Roll out a small ball of foam clay and then slowly flatten it down as evenly as you can. Then bring out the big guns. Anything smooth, round, and or heavy will do. I rolled it out to a thickness of about 1 to 2 millimeters, but this depends on your application. I wanted it pretty thin, but not so thin that it was going to get ripped. Once it's nice and even, place the foam clay on the indented half of the folder. You'll want to place it either in the center or a little closer to the bottom, and then using your makeshift rolling pin, carefully roll over the clay. You'll want to keep steady pressure so the foam clay doesn't shift underneath. And then you're done. You can pull the clay out as it is, or if your piece is super thin and fragile, you can throw the whole thing in the freezer for a few minutes before unmolding. After that, you simply set them aside to dry. Cure time varies based on thickness, but I let these sit for 24 hours on each side just to be safe. Now they're ready to make the sword extra awesome. For some areas, I just cut out an extra layer to add. Some shapes were trickier and needed a pattern. I will note you should be super careful when gluing these pieces. It's one and done with placement. You can't make adjustments since the foam clay is so thin. If you try to move it afterwards, it will rip. For sanding, I recommend using a stone bit instead of a sanding drum. The stone bit is a little more gentle on the edges of the foam clay, and it provides a much smoother finish. Now onto the shattered blade. This task may seem a little daunting at first, but as long as you keep your pieces organized and take your time, you won't have any problems. For all the little blade pieces, I used a single sheet of 10mm EVA 60. Back to that little issue I mentioned earlier, the clearance of the rod that I bought and the foam is very small. See where I'm going with this? You'll need some very careful drilling skills and a lot of patience to make this work. But as you'll see, it's totally doable. I started by cutting out all the pieces and making sure to transfer all of my very important labels. Once they were all cut, I went back to my paper patterns and marked the points of overlap. This is where things become a little bit of a puzzle. Just take your time and be mindful of which pieces are overlapping. For cutting out these areas, you can use a small Dremel sanding drum or a very sharp knife, whichever seems easier for you. However, I did have trouble getting the Dremel into certain areas, so if you're confident with a small knife, that's definitely the better way to go. It's a bit tedious getting all the pieces to fit together just right, but take your time with the adjustments and you'll be much happier in the end. Now for the tricky bit, the drilling. I did this mostly off camera because it was super difficult, but what I did was I laid each piece flat on the very edge of the counter and then aimed the drill parallel with the counter and drilled very slowly. Once I was partially through, I would hold the piece in my hand so that I could feel if the bit was coming too close to either side. This is very tricky and you're definitely going to ruin a few, but don't get discouraged because it is completely possible. You'll find it gets easier with each piece. I recommend doing each piece one at a time in sequence and be prepared to tweak. Don't worry about the pattern at this stage, just make sure that each one fits into the next. And also make sure they fit together straight. I had to do a lot of adjustment down the row to make sure that they weren't totally curving off to one side, because that will happen. And now we bevel. The bevel lines are marked on the pattern, but I had to take liberties based on where my drill hole was. You wouldn't want to sand through it and ruin all of your hard work. I did all of my beveling with the Dremel and later cleaned this up with a grinding stone bit for smoothness. There were a few areas where the bevel went a little too deep. This is gonna happen, but I easily touched up these areas with glue, foam clay, or both. Next, I used my wood burning tool to create all the cracks and battle damage. It's really coming together now. The last steps before assembly were these little ring things that I made with scrap EVA 38 and then a little bit of touch up with Quick Seal. And now we string it all together. Now time for the sealing. Having learned from my Huntress axe, I will be coating the whole blade in 3 coats of Flex Bond, followed by 3 to 4 coats of Plastidip over the whole sword. Finally, we have the best of both worlds. For the painting, I airbrushed on 3 coats of golden high flow silver paint. The buildup of the coats made for a slightly sandy texture in some spots. This totally could have been my fault, but either way, I sanded it back a little bit and then brushed on 1 more coat of the same paint. Next, I did a black acrylic wash to really bring out the cracks. Make sure to wipe this up quick in order to avoid unwanted black smudges. However, for the handle, I really liked the smudgy look. To get a more tarnished antique finish, I added a heavy coat of the black wash and then dabbed it lightly with a paper towel to remove the paint unevenly. For a little extra detail, I added some silver Sharpie to the hard edges to really sell the metal finish. Now we seal it up with 2 to 3 good coats of clear coat. And now for the blood. For the dry brushed blood, I used a mix of red and brown for a dirtier look. And for the big splatters, I used a mix of red, black, and a little gloss. You can also add water or some sort of flow medium to get a better spattering consistency, and then you just whack away. I found a very close and decisive hit worked best, and then built it up in layers. And remember kids, splatter risk is high, so be sure to dress accordingly. Once I have some nice looking spray, I go back in with a brush to add more body to certain areas to better match my reference images. But be sure to have fun with this. And once it's dry, be sure to add a coat of the triple thick gloss coating to all of the blood. This will really sell the wet look. The last step for this sword was honestly one of the hardest. The wrapping of the handle. I really felt like I had to learn an ancient art just to get this part right. I used some of the actual cord that they use to wrap genuine katana handles because it wasn't that expensive, and I thought what better thing to do the job. I will link the video I used for this wrapping technique in the description, but it is worth noting that it took several tries to get the diamonds to look anywhere near symmetrical. They are by no means perfect, but I'm proud I managed what I did. And that's it. She's done. And she's pretty freaking awesome if I do say so myself. So that about wraps it up, guys. No pun intended. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know I had entirely too much fun making this. This has got to be one of the coolest props I've ever made. And I learned so much, which is always super important to me. I hope some of the new techniques I introduced in this video are helpful to you and your future projects. And of course, please let me know what weapon you'd like to see next in the comments. I'm not gonna lie, the next prop/video is already in progress. I just can't help myself. Now that we have been sponsored to cover a lot of them, please let me know which ones you want to see first, because obviously I can make a whole bunch more than I plan now, which is super exciting. So yes, definitely let me know. And also be sure to check out our sponsor, Coscom Cosplay Supplies. You can find almost everything you need to make this entire prop from start to finish, so definitely check them out. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, please feel free to reach out. I am always open to help my fellow cosplayers. But until then, be sure to stay tuned for awesome.